Well, we'll get started. Okay. Dear Father, thank you for this day and everything that you've provided for us. Thank you for the message from Pastor Brandon this morning and how, when we seek after you, we can really just feel your presence, understand who you are, and the life and the purpose that you have for us, and how there really is nothing better than seeking after you and really trusting in your word for our lives. So I want to thank you for that. Thank you for your son Jesus and how his death, burial, and resurrection means so much to us, how it gives us life and is the reason why we have purpose. So we love you so much, and in Jesus' name, amen. Yeah, so this week we're going over the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, actually. We're going over the historical arguments for it, and specifically covering the what Dr. Gary Habermas has coined the minimal facts approach. So yeah, in this series we've been going over a whole bunch of topics, but specifically covering whether the New Testament is historically reliable, and the Gospels are probably the biggest part of that debate. So last week we covered key claims. What are the things that the Gospels and the New Testament claim to be factually true? That means that they are claiming something that has to be attached to reality, not just something spiritual or whatever, but they're claiming something is true about reality. And we learned a fair amount about that, and then we also learned about how skeptics answer that, what they claim is wrong about the Gospels. And this week we're going over the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, which is a very specific claim. In fact, I would argue the central claim of the entire New Testament is the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And then we're taking a break. We're taking a break until the new year, in which case we'll come back and get into more details and evidence. So as far as sources, we have Cold Case Christianity, written by J. Warner Wallace, and we also have the Historicity of the Resurrection of Jesus, historiographical considerations in the light of recent debates, by Mike Licona. This is his PhD dissertation, which is probably why it has such a crazy title.
Checks out.
Yeah, checks out. So today, my main point really is that the Gospels accurately and truthfully convey the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and we'll go into that in a bit more detail. But the idea really is have you ever heard people say, "Oh no, that didn't really happen," or they were just lying about it, etc. They were just making this stuff up, or you can't how much can you really trust ancient documents? We're gonna hopefully learn how to respond to those a little bit. So once again, we are going into the minimal facts approach. So this idea, it was coined by Dr. Gary Habermas, who's a well-known New Testament scholar on this topic. And the approach tries to identify specifically what scholars, all kinds of scholars, skeptical scholars, Christian scholars, Jewish scholars, whatever have you, any sort of historical scholar, what they agree with, and then go from there. So where is their scholarly consensus? And in fact, nearly unanimous scholarly consensus, and then go from there. And Mike Licona took this approach in his PhD dissertation, and so this is what he came away with. He came away with three what he considers minimal facts, or he actually calls historical bedrock. And that's the idea of you can take these, if you can take any fact in history to be true, you can take these to be true. And then he has what he calls second order facts, which are nearly there, but not quite there. An example of this is James's conversion, where he found that while there is scholarly unanimity, meaning that all scholars agree that James converted as a result of his belief that Jesus had risen from the dead. There aren't that many scholars who actually comment on this topic, so he included it as a second order fact. So I'll go over some of these really quick. Let's see here. So first of all, Jesus' death by crucifixion. This is just widely regarded as true by every historical scholar. Bart Ehrman, a well-known atheist New Testament scholar, has said, if there is any fact about Jesus that we know to be certain, it's that he died by crucifixion. And in fact, he goes even further than that to say, we know this as good as any other historical fact in history. Pretty much. It's quite a strong statement. Then going from there, the second minimal fact or baseline history is the fact that the disciples had an experience that caused them to believe Jesus had risen from the dead. This is something that all scholars agree on. And then the third is Paul's experience that caused him to believe similarly to the disciples, but it was a separate experience from just what the disciples had. And so it's these three things that kind of go together, and it's from these that you can actually build quite a robust argument for what Mike Licona calls the resurrection hypothesis. The idea that Jesus actually supernaturally rose from the dead. But we will go a little bit further, and James Warner Wallace in his book goes a little bit further, where he accepts not only these three facts, but he accepts the tomb being empty. And when you accept the tomb being empty, it really just makes so many other arguments easier and less, less philosophical, less like social sciencey. So one of the first things I did want to note about these, specifically about these questions or these minimal facts, is what do they say about the Gospels? If we just take these as true, what are some of the very broad strokes we can talk about the Gospels? And one of the major ones that points out to me is, in this bedrock, there's nothing that contradicts any of the Gospels. And in fact, it sounds quite a bit like the Gospel story when you read them. Oh, okay, Jesus died by crucifixion. His disciples had an experience that caused them to believe he had risen from the dead, and Paul had an experience that caused him to believe he had risen from the dead. Now, Paul's experience isn't contained in the Gospels, but it's contained in Acts. And so it's like, wow, that's actually quite similar to the sort of things that you would expect to have been written. The Gospels are. If you just take those facts and you go, well, what if someone was going to write a story that was going to contain these facts? The Gospels match up quite closely with that. And of course, it's not a guarantee that everything in the Gospels is correct, but rather it is something just to note. Because once again, when we go through and evaluate possible explanations, we want to do it in a logical and consistent manner. We want to make sure we're not giving preferential bias to one argument or another argument. So as a result, we need to evaluate them based on not only if they can explain these minimal facts, but also how well they explain them and just how much it makes sense, right? It's actually kind of crazy. Dr. Habermas wrote an article about Mike Licona's dissertation, and he said that he investigated over 3,400 different scholarly sources on these topics, and in his research to determine whether he had truly identified universal agreement. I mean, they went to extreme lengths to determine what universal agreement was, instead of just simply superficial ones. It's a very thorough, attempting to be as unbiased as possible investigation of these things, and so it's something where we can take advantage of that. So let's go into some of the possible explanations that people have proposed for these minimal facts. So obviously from the get-go, the first one is kind of just out of the picture if you take those minimal facts. But this is an argument that many Muslims will make. So many Muslims take the theory that the Quran puts forward that Jesus somehow miraculously survived crucifixion. And so this is a thing that they will pit to you, and so it's good to be prepared to defend against this particular argument. If not only because there are people who believe that, oh no, Jesus didn't really die. That's how they said he rose from the dead, is that the disciples just thought he died. Another one would be that the disciples' story was changed. This is a fairly common one as well, although it's not used a ton on its own. Disciples lied, they were delusional, they were fooled by an imposter, had limited spiritual experiences. That one's kind of an interesting one, where it's kind of a mixture of they were delusional but not at the same time. And then finally the last one, that Jesus rose from the dead. And I took all of these from Cold Case Christianity. So these are all the ones that he goes over. And once again, these are not all the possible explanations. These are just the ones that are most common. And really anything that is at all reasonable is going to be some mixture of these. So yeah, do you have any questions about that? Nope. Okay. And yeah, so as an example, in Licona's dissertation, he weighs five different hypotheses from various atheistic scholars, and they're all really a combination of number 4 and 6, kind of with number 2 at times. So as far as, I guess what you'd say, modern atheistic scholarship, they really don't use some of these ones, particularly the ones that the disciples lied. That one is kind of out the window. So we'll go into them in a bit more detail here. So the first one is that, of course, Jesus survived crucifixion, which is kind of funny, because the idea that he would have survived crucifixion in the culture is kind of patently absurd. If you know anything about Roman culture and how crucifixions were performed, it was a very particular methodical process that the, I guess, guards who were in charge of it would have performed many times over. They knew how to do it. They knew how to make sure someone was dead at the end of it. Death was not uncommon in this time. And it's actually even crazier than that. It was a Roman rule that if you, the crucifier, the guard in charge of making sure that this crucifixion was taken care of, if you did not perform it properly, or whoever you crucified survived, you yourself would be crucified. It was a serious thing. Of course, the punishments that they handed out were not taken as seriously as we take them out today. We don't hand out the death penalty frequently, but Rome in that time did hand it out fairly frequently, and the gospel writers actually record and document this process accurately. So the particular details that they include about crucifixion lead us to believe that they actually witnessed a crucifixion.
And that one always just seems like kind of absurd, that if you're like you try to disprove Christianity, like why you'd say, oh, he just never died. He was he was on the cross, but he was just fine.
And so like I said, this argument is not really used by atheists or scholars. It really is primarily used by Muslims who take a particular view of the Quran, and I believe it's like the predominant Sunni view is that Jesus survived crucifixion, miraculously. That when they took him off the cross, he was like almost dead. You know, like in The Princess Bride, where they take Wesley to the doctor, and it's like, oh no, he's not all the way dead. He's almost dead. You know. It's a bit of an absurd situation, but of course, in the Muslim view, miracles aren't impossible, so they just require a different kind of miracle from God than what the Gospels describe. This view, of course, is very easy to refute. Not only is there scholarly unanimity that Jesus was crucified on the cross, but there are a number of other reasons to disbelieve this. One being the disciples knew when someone was dead. Death, again, was not uncommon in this time. All you need to do is go look up statistics on, say, like, death rates, various reasons why people died, death in childbirth, etc., to figure out that most everyone would have experienced someone having died in a, let's put it, a not natural manner. Additionally, historical and scholarly sources claim this. So once again, as part of the bedrock, we know that modern scholars not only agree that Jesus was crucified, but non-biblical historical sources also agree that Jesus was crucified. So, for example, Tacitus, a Roman historian, Josephus, a Jewish historian who served in the Roman emperor's court, both agreed that Jesus was crucified on the cross, among others. Also, Jesus was never seen again after his ascension. If he had not actually died, then he would have been walking around somewhere, right? Presumably he would have been able to have been seen by other people, and if this idea that Jesus survived crucifixion goes to show that he's not God, then he could not have rose to heaven, which once again means you would expect him to have other things written about him that just don't really appear in the historical record. The next is that the disciples' story was changed. So this possibility tries to claim that Jesus died on the cross but never rose again, and that his story was mythologized over time, kind of turned into legend, so that the disciples themselves never really claimed that Jesus rose from the dead, and the disciples themselves never really believed that Jesus rose from the dead, but rather that they were trying to tell a story to empower people to join the kingdom of God. One of the particular views of this is a very postmodern reading on history, where instead of the disciples talking about Jesus literally rising from the dead, a proclamation of Jesus rising from the dead is more of a spiritual one, more of one indicating that the kingdom of God is here and God's great plan to restore humanity is still on its way. Of course, this has many problems with it as well. First of all, the disciples from the very, very, very beginning, the earliest documents that we have of Christianity include the proclamation of Jesus' resurrection from the grave. So you would need to explain why, in particular, it's not a bodily resurrection or some sort of real resurrection that the disciples would have understood, and more of this, social resurrection. And then second, you have 1 Corinthians 15, which records that the earliest sort of creed that we have in Christianity, that Jesus died and was buried and then on the third day rose again. Once again, this particular creed predates when a lot of scholars would even date the Gospels themselves. So it's very difficult to say that the story was mythologized over time when you have these early creeds from the very, very beginning. And actually, just recently, there was it wasn't a temple, it was like a dedication, a memorial dedicated to Jesus that had an inscription that they found that dates to, I believe, the 2nd century 2nd or 3rd century AD. And so it's the earliest archaeological evidence that we have, not manuscript evidence, but earliest archaeological evidence that we have that people believe Jesus rose from the dead, because it says that right on its mosaic. It's pretty cool.
For the like the disciples themselves, is there sources that like mention them outside of Scripture?
Yes, there are many sources that mention the disciples themselves outside of Scripture. Most notably, other early church fathers who wrote significantly about this. So, like, I believe his name is like Pappus or Origen or Polycarp. All of those early church fathers wrote about the disciples, and that is where we get a lot of our additional information about what happened to the disciples after Jesus ascended into heaven, after Acts. Well, and after Acts ends.
Are there any other written historical document from people other than the early church fathers who mention?
So, kind of. I'm not super familiar with that particular question, but the answer is almost certainly that Christianity was becoming more and more. People were becoming more and more familiar with Christianity, even if they might not have been too particular about the details of who were the true early Christians. For example, Nero was a very famous persecutor of Christians, so he knew who Christians were and he vehemently opposed their narrative. And so while Nero himself might not have known the name Peter or the name Paul, he certainly cared enough to try to kill them. And so this, again, kind of feeds into this idea that the story hasn't changed that much over time. One interesting one about this is early opponents to Christianity did not use the argument that their story had changed. Because, so if you think about it from the perspective of the time when Christianity is starting up, the opponents of Christianity said, oh no, Jesus' body was stolen. Well, if he didn't rise from the dead, if that was never a claim, they would have never needed to say that his body was stolen to refute Christianity, right? If Christianity never claimed that Jesus' body had been raised from the dead, then you don't ever need to present something to try to refute that. So the mere fact that early Jews and early opponents to Christianity claimed that there was some other reason why Jesus' body was missing is evidence that the disciples' story was that way from the beginning, because they had to have something to oppose. If the disciples never claimed that if the disciples never claimed that Jesus rose from the dead, then there would have needed to be no reason to even go looking for Jesus' body. Everyone would just know, yeah, that's where he was buried.
Both sides claimed the body was missing.
Yeah. In effect, in the early history, both sides end up claiming the body was missing, and this is a very strong evidence for the tomb actually being empty, but not all historical scholars believe that. Some will propose that, say they went to the wrong tomb, they just forgot the tomb, they buried Jesus in.
In the cupboard.
Yeah. Which is pretty funny, I'd say, but anyway, that's not exactly here nor there, but the point is that it doesn't really hold up with this, and again, claiming this wouldn't really explain the change that the disciples went through either. If the disciples just knew that their supposed Messiah had been crucified and never rose from the dead, but they tried to go along with the plan anyways, well, why would we observe that transformation? You're directly contradicting that the gospel said they were scattered, that they were in hiding, and yet then they decide to just come out of hiding for no good reason at all to proclaim this gospel message, which isn't really that much of a gospel message, as Paul later says in 1 Corinthians 15. So it's, again, directly refutes this whole idea that the story had changed over time. Yeah, any other questions or comments about that? Okay, third one. The disciples lied. This one to me is honestly the most ridiculous one, because if you know anything about early church history and what is claimed about the disciples and their lives after Acts ends, well, in fact, even during Acts we get to see this a lot, you realize that every single disciple, every single one except John, the apostle, really every single apostle actually, every single one except John was murdered for their beliefs. So, knowing the time that they're in, knowing that they're going to be persecuted, why would they hold up a conspiracy that's not only lying about something that's crucially true, that's crucial to their belief system, but also they would have had to have stolen the body. In this case, they would have had to have stolen Jesus' body in order to make it appear as if he rose from the dead. So that would require potentially not only the disciples, but also maybe the guards, because the guards said they didn't know what happened. Well, that is a pretty poor excuse for a guard, right? You're literally set here to do this one exact thing, and then you fail to do that. And you say, I don't know what happened. That's not a very good excuse. And so the point is, the disciples did not gain any benefit at all by going along with this conspiracy. They were poor conspirators because they were not all related to each other. They came from various different backgrounds. I mean, Matthew was a tax collector. You have a Simon who was a zealot who probably at one point in his life wanted to kill people like Matthew. So why they would choose to stick together doesn't really make sense. And that feeds into the poor reasons to lie. Again, they would not have gained much power, much prestige because of this particular claim, and they risked their lives, and in fact ended up sacrificing their lives for this claim, which people don't really choose to die for something that they know is untrue. It's just not a thing that we see. And lies don't transform people. Once again, we would have had to go from a state in which the disciples are all hiding, running for their lives, where Peter is denying Jesus, back to where they're proclaiming stuff as if something miraculous happened, when in fact they had to have known that it did not happen. So again, just not very reasonable. So now we're getting into some of the more, I guess I'd say, detailed claims and ones that are used more often by scholars, I would say. This first one's a pretty interesting idea. So it's the idea that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, but that his disciples, because they had experienced his very traumatic death, were kind of traumatized about that, and then end up having a hallucination that Jesus appeared to them, had risen from the dead, and then wrote down what they experienced, and then Christianity took off from there. So in other words, their experience was real to them, but it wasn't factual. It wasn't tied to the real world. They were experiencing something that to them appeared very, very real, but it just wasn't actually real. And there are many problems with this idea as well. First of all, we know from studying psychology, people don't hallucinate in groups. If they do, it's drug-induced, but they're not all hallucinating the same thing. And additionally, while people may sometimes believe aspects of a hallucination, they rarely believe all of it. After coming out of their heightened state of awareness, let's put it, they will often realize that there are some things that are just clearly crazy about what they had experienced, but on the other hand, maybe other things they didn't. So point is, it's pretty rare for someone to just wholesale accept a hallucination. It also would not have been very detailed. We know that when people hallucinate, they don't remember very fine specific details about the whatever they hallucinated. And so we would expect the Gospels to either be inaccurate, wrong about certain aspects of their testimony, or to just lack those entirely. But in fact, the Gospels are very particularly clear about things, like, for example, that Thomas or that Jesus offered for the disciples to actually touch and feel him, which is not something that is common in hallucinations. So, and then additionally, hallucinations aren't sustained across multiple different events, a series of events. Jesus is claimed to have appeared to many different people over a series of time, right? He appeared to the disciples several times in distinct occasions. So, would they have had to have had multiple group hallucinations where they were all seeing the same thing, and afterwards they were talking about it with each other, and they all agreed that they had seen the same thing? It just seems a little bit of a stretch. And then once again, if we're talking about the empty tomb, well, what about the body? If Jesus' body is actually missing, then this argument falls apart, because you would need then to have them have a hallucination, but then decide to steal his body for some reason, and so you end up with a conspiracy. It doesn't make sense. And then again, what about Paul and the 500 others? Paul was an opponent to Jesus. He would not have been prone to a hallucination that looked favorably upon Jesus, let alone 500 other people. How in the world are you going to get 500 people to all see a sort of vision that Jesus actually appeared in the flesh? So once again, it doesn't make that much sense. And so this is where, like I said, it's usually a combination of this and this. And because it's unreasonable to have hallucinations for like 500 people. Instead, they will argue that the Gospels were a little inaccurate about, or sorry, not the Gospels, but Paul was being inaccurate about those 500 people, particularly in their experience. And so one argument that I heard was that, say, Peter and Paul had their own hallucinations that happened to line up, and then they went on to convince everyone else to believe them. But once again, where is the evidence for that? We don't have any evidence for that. What we have in the gospel testimony is evidence actually against that to a degree. So it's very often people will come up with reasonable sounding explanations that when you investigate them, they don't actually have evidence for. They're just kind of making it up. And you have to ask why. So finally, well, we'll get to that. We'll get to this other one, that the disciples were fooled. So this idea is that there was some sort of imposter who came after Jesus was crucified and said, "Hey, I'm Jesus. I look a little bit different now because I rose from the dead, but it's really me." And there you go. And so it's actually a pretty funny idea that someone could go around and fool the disciples that they were actually Jesus and like perform miracles in front of them. So it's like, okay, well, if they actually perform miracles, then, again, this explanation kind of goes out without, if they're really able to perform real supernatural miracles, this imposter, then maybe this imposter was actually Jesus. On the other hand, if they weren't, then why would the disciples be fooled into having been believed that this person could perform miracles? You would have also had to have acted like Jesus, known Jesus really better than the disciples, which again is not really that feasible.
Like if a guy that kind of looked like you, I think we would be able to tell that he's a different person.
Yeah, exactly. What about the body again? This goes back to that idea, if you accept that the tomb is empty, well, what about the body? If there's this imposter that shows up, someone would have had the idea of, well, hey, they said Jesus came back, but I don't remember him looking this way. Maybe I should just go double check real quick. Would not have been that difficult. I mean, they had tombs with stones that rolled away expressly for the purpose so that they could care for them over time. It was a very common thing. And in fact, I don't think many people realize that about ancient Jewish culture. A little bit different from our culture nowadays. When we bury people, we want them to stay there. In Jewish culture, however, they shared tombs. So if someone from your family died, you would likely place them in the tomb where their fathers were, where their ancestors were. And after their body had decayed, you would take their bones, put them in a little box, and still store it in the same tomb. So what was particularly unique about Jesus' case is instead of being stored in a tomb by where his biological parents were, which is weird to say biological because Mary, yes, but Joseph, no. So anyway, instead of being stored by where his human ancestors were, he was stored in a brand new tomb, which would not have had any of those things. But it would have been very easy, once again, for them to roll a stone aside and, hey, is his body still there? And in fact, this is partly what we see. Mary and, like Mary Magdalene and the group of other women, were going to help preserve his body again, right? So they were going with the express purpose to open up the tomb and take care of his body. So it is, again, another one of those things where you go, well, what about the body? And then finally, what would this imposter's motivation have been? Again, it's just something that is never, ever at all alluded to by anyone, any opponent of Christianity, really at all, probably until Islam comes around. And even then, I don't believe that they were saying that it was specifically an imposter that fooled them into believing Jesus rose from the dead. The specific Islamic case that I've heard, which is an Ahmadi case, is that it was an imposter who was crucified. So that somewhere along the lines when Jesus was carrying his cross up to the hill, that was it another Simon of Cyrene, was actually exchanged for Jesus, and that Jesus' face was placed on Simon miraculously by Allah. And so that's a different thing. So it's lots of different explanations. And then finally, the idea that the disciples had limited spiritual experiences. So this goes along kind of with their delusional, but it was much more limited, that maybe one or two of them had a vision that they convinced the others to believe. But once again, you go back to if you accept that the tomb is empty, well, what about the body? And then again, what about Paul? Paul could not really have been convinced, so Paul must have been one of these people that had a vision, in which case he would not have been prone to any sort of vision or trance or anything along these lines that would have looked favorably upon Jesus Christ. Many scholars, or I've heard several scholars claim that Paul was somehow internally dissatisfied with Jewish customs and the Pharisaical movement, and so he wanted to kind of turn Christianity into his own thing, and so. But secretly, he didn't want that publicly. He just secretly wanted something, and then he has this vision that causes this to occur. Once again, there's no evidence for that. There's no historical basis for that, and then that would actually kind of pit Paul against the disciples in a way, which we again don't really see. Every single claim as pertaining to the resurrection of Jesus Christ from early Christians matches up. And then again, it requires people to be fools or blindly trusting. If Peter comes back after having denied Jesus 3 times and says, hey guys, I just saw Jesus. He's alive. And they're like, really? And Thomas goes up to him and says, yeah, I'm not going to believe until I can put my fingers in his, nail wounds. And Peter goes, no, just trust me. Just trust me, guys. It really happened. And Thomas goes, oh, okay, great. You know what's even better? Matthew, John, how about you write about the fact that I doubted, but then I saw Jesus, and, it just doesn't make any sense. And so people like Thomas would have had to either been a fool to literally go against his direct word, or just so blindly trusting as to not even imagine that they could go to the tomb and open it up. And yeah, so then that gets us to our final explanation, which is that Jesus rose from the dead. And the only particular problem about this is that if this is true, it requires belief in the supernatural. As we talked about before, the naturalistic worldview that many of these scholars who propose alternative explanations start with, they start with a naturalistic one, which is the assumption that supernatural events can't happen. As C.S. Lewis has said in his book Miracles, if what we experience are just a sequence of events, then we're trying, by defining natural law, we're trying to categorize all of those events. But by having witnessed events, that does not determine what events we will see in the future. We're just assuming that we'll see events that match the pattern that we've seen, but we have no real evidential reason to believe that we won't see a supernatural one in the future. And so, again, if this natural law is something that we're observing because we see a pattern to things, because we believe in a creator, then it makes sense that God could give one that has a pattern that we don't recognize, such as a supernatural event. So, yeah, there we go. That is some of the arguments around it. And yeah, one of the things you'll notice is this one actually has the fewest problems. There's all sorts of other problems that you can put together, but this one most clearly describes not only how Christianity started, but it matches with all of the actual factual history that we do have surrounding this topic. And this photo actually is a photo of the Shroud of Turin. It's really cool. So it's this burial shroud that many people believe may have actually been the shroud covering Jesus when he was buried. There's a bunch of particular facts because there's all sorts of dried blood on it and whatever else. But this imprint, this image, is something that could not have actually we don't really know how it could have been made naturally at that time. It's the equivalent of nowadays would have been if you had like a photo screen and you shined like a super bright light through it to make that imprint. It's pretty crazy. So
other people who were covered in shrouds, it didn't leave a mark like that.
Well, it might have. Exactly. This here is a lightening and darkening of the fibers themselves,
Okay.
not via some other material.
Okay.
So it's not like it's been painted. It's not like it's been stained with blood. There are blood stains on the shroud, but these specific patterns were not left that way. And in fact, it's another mystery, let's put it, where modern scholars don't know how it would have ever been possible for that sort of mark to be left on the shroud in the time to which it was dated. So,
just thinking how interesting it would be if there were ever enough material to get a DNA sample.
Yeah.
What would Jesus' DNA be? Would it just be all Mary's? Would it be Mary's plus some supernatural?
well, so there's
Yeah.
I think I heard something really funny where I don't know how I'm pretty sure it's not true, but I did hear like a sort of speculation thing where someone's like, oh yeah, no, they did take DNA from it, but they found that it only had like half of the chromosomes or something like that. But I don't believe that's
You would think
that.
someone would have tried to take the DNA from the blood, wouldn't you?
So I believe so, but it's so old that I don't think it's usable with current technology. I do think maybe in the future, as technology gets better at being able to use smaller and smaller samples, that it might actually work. But yeah, so I thought it was pretty interesting. But of course, the shroud, it has actual marks and bloodstains where you would expect them to be according to the gospel stories. And
So nowadays, like, what would cause that? Is the fibers to change, like heat?
So
Or
it wouldn't be heat. Many people have proposed that it was heat, but it wouldn't actually be heat. It really is a sort of you could do it with ultraviolet light. So think about if you took the power of the sun, but shined it through a sort of filter to make this pattern. You could then cause the fibers to lighten and darken in the way that you wanted. But the question isn't how is it possible nowadays. The question is how is it possible 2,000 years ago.
Right.
So it's very very interesting. There's no agreement as to whether this is actually the shroud that covered Jesus. But if anyone says they have an explanation for how this happened, they should they could probably win a Pulitzer, or not a Pulitzer, some sort of award.
Yeah,
from,
right. They're
very
gonna get the Nobel
prestigious.
Peace Prize for this.
Yeah.
The enhanced image reminds me more of the Knights Templar from Indiana Jones.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does. I believe this is an X-ray image. So this is a regular color image, and then this is an X-ray image. So.
The negative?
Oh, actually, you know what? Maybe it is. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's just a negative of a color. Yeah.
Yeah. Looks like someone older.
So.
It looks older than his 30s.
Yeah.
All those even.
So thank you for coming. And yeah, I love this topic. I mean, it's a very, very deep topic. You can just go on and on and on and on. I mean, Mike Licona's PhD dissertation is well over 500 pages, and it covers pretty much every single detail you can imagine with respect to those facts, and he discusses the secondary facts as well, and then gives his reasons for why he excluded them. I don't know if you're here, but like, for example, he mentions that James's conversion is a second order fact, and the reason isn't because he found scholars who disagreed with this idea. The reason was because he found he did not find enough examples of scholars even discussing this topic. But the ones that he did find, they agreed that James converted. And so if you apply, if you take all of these, right, it becomes even worse for all of the other hypotheses and only better for the resurrection hypothesis. That like Jesus' predictions of his death and resurrection, those are a thing that is actually really good evidence. But not all scholars agree on that. The earliest apostles believed Jesus' resurrection was bodily. That is a little bit different because technically the resurrection hypothesis doesn't have to be a bodily resurrection. It could just be a spiritual resurrection. The Gospels really seem to indicate that it was a bodily resurrection, and Paul in particular. So, yeah. Thank you for coming.
Yes, thank you.